Welcome back to our series on Sefer Bereishit. We're going to discuss Parshat Miketz today, and today we're going to sort of go into a wider biblical topic about wealth management in light of the story of Pharaoh's dreams and Yosef's advice to the dreams, and how it might not only explain events in Sefer Bereishit, but also a general theme in Chumash. It has a lot to do with the number 7. Remember, in Pharaoh's dream, first there's 7 fat cows that come up from the Nile, and later, 7 lean cows eat up the 7 fat cows. That's the first dream. And the second dream, there's 7 sheaves of wheat coming up from the Nile. And then the good grain is being swallowed up by the lousy grain. So again, there's the first dream about cows and the second dream about the wheat. What's Yosef's interpretation? He figures out that there'll be 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. But what do the cows come to teach you? That the way that the lean cows stay alive is by eating the fat cows. Meaning, what God is giving sort of advice to Egypt is that there's about to be 7 years of plenty. You have a lot of wealth for the next 7 years. What do you do with that wealth? Save or store that wealth for the lean years coming up. Now, that idea that when you have too much wealth, set it aside for a time when you don't where you need the money, that can work at a personal level. It can also work at a national level. Meaning, in a society, there are people who have wealth, people have less. The question is, how do we share our wealth? Those who are blessed with prosperity, what are they supposed to do with their excess? Now, the number 7 here is key in the dream. Of course, the number 7 goes back to a theme of creation and, of course, of nature. But the main time we have the number 7, the idea of a week, is the story of Shabbat, of course, and the story of the manna. Now, the manna, if you remember, in Parshat Beshalach, fell for 6 days a week, and the 7th day on Shabbat, it didn't fall. But because it wasn't going to fall on Shabbat, they were permitted to collect double on Friday. Look at the pattern that God teaches the Jewish people coming out of Egypt in the desert without food. Okay, they need food. God's going to supply them with food. There'll be plenty of food. The manna will supply food. But the main commandment that they're being trained with the manna, if you remember, is how much can you take? Every day you can take as much as you need, but you can't take more than what you need. Remember, ish lefi ochlo. And the amount you can take, remember the word omer ayin mem resh, is the amount that you can take every day. Comes Friday, Yom Shishi, you're permitted to take double. Why? Because it's not going to fall on Shabbat. So what's God teaching you with Lechem Mishnah? That it's okay to hoard on Friday because you'll need for Shabbat. Now, that idea of the number 6 and 7 teaching the message that you need to take as much as you need, but sometimes there's a need to hoard because sometimes there won't be food available for when you need it. Therefore, I need to store my wealth for times when I don't have wealth. And the first message is simply going to be Friday and Shabbat. I take double on Friday because I won't have on Shabbat. We have almost the same concept by Shemitah, right? There's 6 years where we can store as much as we want. On the 7th year, everyone's equal. Now, on the 7th year, in the Shemitah year, again, the number 6 and 7, but the number 7 teaches us that on the 7th year, everyone's equal. Because everyone has to remember what it's like to live a day at a time. During Shemitah, you can only take as much food as you need from the produce of that growing that year. But you can't hoard that year. There's no asif. There's only, you can malakate, you can take as much as you need for a day at a time, but you can't hoard. But the other 6 years, you're allowed to. But what Chumash is teaching you, it's okay to hoard when you need to, for the sake of the time when you might not have. Now, the main cycle of 6 and 7, or actually the main cycle of 7, is what we call Sfirat HaOmer. In Israel's agriculture, what do we have in the land of Israel? Grain only grows from mid-April to mid-June. That's grain season. It's called the Aviv, or Chag HaMatzot is Chag Aviv, and it ends with the end of the grain harvest in Chag HaKatzir, which we call Shavuot. There's 7 weeks of grain harvest when you collect all the grain, but that grain needs to last you the whole year. Therefore, during our grain harvest, what do we need to do? We need to hoard, meaning we need to collect enough grain for a whole year. So when I'm harvesting my grain, I can't collect grain as much as I need a day at a time, but rather I need to collect for the entire year. and therefore I'm almost obligated to hoard. Now, what do we count during those 7 weeks? We count what's called the Omer, which reminds us of the manna experience. And what's God reminding us? Because the nature of Israel is that wealth is increased 2 months a year. We get a lot of grain, but we need to save that grain for the rest of the year. Even though I'm allowed to hoard, and I need to hoard to take all that excess, that's what I'll need for the rest of the year. Remember, there's always poor people who don't have land, who need all the time, and therefore, even though you need to take the excess, always consider the poor people and keep them in mind. In fact, if you follow in Parshat Emor in Vayikra Chav Gimel, the very last line of the laws of Shavuot, after 7 weeks, you make that holiday, Mikol Kodesh Yelechem after 7 weeks, and then if it says, when you're gathering your wheat, don't take your entire field, leave over what's called pe'ah, and leket, don't take every sheaf of grain, that's called leket, shicha, and pe'ah. Leave them for the poor and the needy. There's a whole Megillah about it, Megillah Ruth. But that idea of wealth management in Judaism, always be considerate of the needs of others when you're collecting your wealth. If God blesses you with wealth and prosperity, use it almost as a trustee to help those who are in need. At the time of harvest itself, and also later with my excess storage. You need to store the excess, but don't overstore. And always keep in mind there are other people who need. So it could be that whole theme of the idea of recognizing when God blesses us with prosperity and excess, it's in order that we use it to help those in need, might begin here with the story of Pharaoh. Now, how does it affect what happens later in Bereishit? In fact, we'll see even possibly later in Shemot. Yosef gave this advice to Pharaoh, that what should he do? He should collect the grain in Egypt during the 7 years of plenty, and then though it'll be available for the 7 years of famine. Because remember those cows, the 7 lean cows were able to stay alive because of the grain of the 7 good years, eating the 7 fat cows. What should have Egypt done? They should have stored the grain during the 7 years of plenty, almost like Social Security. And then during the 7 years of famine, they should give it back to the people that they collected it from. What did they do instead? In other words, they store it, but instead of giving it back to the people, or maybe at a minimal price, what do? The people in Egypt, because of the famine, are in a situation where they can't afford anything. And the first year, remember, they sell their fields to Egypt. They sell their fields for grain. Then they sell themselves, and then they move them around. Basically, Pharaoh, thanks to Yosef's advice, is able to buy up all the land in Egypt, and basically all the people in Egypt, thanks to saving up from the famine. Saving up the good years and selling it at high prices, I guess, during the famine. Was that the right thing to do, or wrong thing to do? That's an interesting discussion. Legally, I'm sure it's fine. The question is, possibly, did we pay a price for that policy? Now, again, it's Pharaoh's policy. I don't think it was Yosef's. It was Yosef's idea to store it, to use that extra storage and charge high prices for it and buy up all the land of Egypt. Was that taking advantage? Was that leverage on the people? That you could argue. Again, I'm not blaming Yosef for that, but basically that's what happened. Don't be surprised that several decades later, what happens? There's a new king in Egypt. It means there's a new a new dynasty in Egypt. Because what happens in Egypt every 50, 100 years? Someone from the inside. There's always a takeover. Remember, there's like some 30 dynasties in ancient Egypt. Every several decades, at least every 100 years or so, there's a new family in Egypt that takes over Egypt, or an outside invader who takes over Egypt. There's always different dynasties. And when one dynasty takes over from an old dynasty, they punish the people from the previous one. It could be, again, we're suggesting, we don't know for sure, it could be the reason why there's a new Pharaoh in Egypt in the beginning of Sefer Shemot who doesn't remember Yosef or doesn't thank Yosef, because there's a new dynasty. The people, there's an uprising of the people because they're angry at the previous dynasty that Yosef was part of, where they basically took all their land and all their freedom. And because of that, they rebelled. They took over the country. Who's going to be punished? The people behind the old administration. And that might be the underlying reason what enabled the Egyptians to enslave the Hebrews, or basically Yosef's family and his descendants. Again, I'm not saying for sure that happened, but it's an idea to entertain. It might be a logical reason of what happened. Now, we needed to go down to Egypt anyhow. The question is, it could be that one of the possible reasons for the shibud, our enslavement in Egypt, might have been so bad. Maybe we should have been more careful in Egypt with that policy, with our economic policy of taking the grain that was stored, that should have been given to the people to help them. Taking advantage of that might be something that might have been the ideal. Again, I'm not saying who's to blame for it. I'm saying who the people blame for it. And it could be one of the underlying reasons what caused the enslavement to begin. That theme later in the Torah, that you can't miss. Because what does God always want us to do? If you remember Parshat Ekev in Sefer Dvarim, in Bereishit, Moshe Rabbeinu tells the people in the 40th year, remember your 40 years in the desert, and remember the manna experience that you went through. Remember that God gave you minimal food to eat in the desert in order to appreciate, when you come to the land of Israel, what to do with your wealth. And if we read in Parshat Ekev, in Bereishit, what's the danger of wealth? God's bringing you to a good land. Eretz Chita v'Sorah, Gefen Teinav Rimon. God's giving you a land that nothing's missing. And therefore, V'chalta v'Savata Be'arachta. You're supposed to eat and be satisfied, but thank God for it by helping others again. And he says, be careful, you might forget God, and you might become too wealthy. Pentochal v'Savata batim tavim tivne v'yashavta, and all your wealth will grow, etc. And then, what's the fear? V'ram lavavecha, you become haughty with your wealth, and you forget the God who took you out of Egypt, the God who gave you the manna, who took you through the desert, and you'll say, Kochi v'atzam yadi, my own strength gave me this ability to make all this great wealth, all this chayil, this all economic growth. The Torah doesn't say, therefore, be poor. Rather, you should be wealthy, but remember, Pasuk Yudchet in Bereishit in Ekev, v'zacharta et Hashem Elokecha ki hu hanoten lecha koach le'osed chayil. Remember, it's God who made the system of nature. God gave you the ability to amass your wealth. God chose a nation to be his model nation. God chose a nation and gave us a land that has great potential to amass wealth and have excess. What do we do with our wealth? What do we do with that excess? How do we take our economic growth and use it to sanctify God by sharing that wealth with people in need? And again, managing wealth. Again, there's a need to raise capital and have wealth and do great projects with it. But is the goal simply having a lot of wealth, or is the goal using that wealth to help society and help others? Again, how much you have to store, that everyone has to decide on their own. But the basic idea that when God blesses you with wealth through nature, and you have all that wealth, what you do with it, you become a trustee, and the way you thank God for that wealth is that's by saying thank you, by acting thank you, and using it to help others in need. That's going to be a mega theme to the rest of Chumash. And again, as we're studying Sefer Bereishit and looking for the wider themes of Chumash in general, not just Sefer Bereishit, but what's developing Chumash, God choosing a nation to become his nation forever, it could be in the story of Pharaoh's dream, in the 7 years of famine and 7 years of plenty that preceded it, to enable survival during the 7 years of famine. That might be teaching us a message about wealth management. And one of the underlying reasons why God's choosing a nation, giving us a land, he wants us to be a land, he wants us to be a nation and a land with prosperity. We sanctify God by how we manage that prosperity, what we do with our wealth, and not just thanking God for our wealth, but also acting thank you and building a just society that other nations can learn from, how to live a life of sanctity and be in recognition of God. And the whole theme of the number 7, ever since day one, ever since the story of creation, it's been a big theme. And maybe the underlying theme of creation, the stories in Bereishit, even from Pharaoh's dreams to the story of the manna, to the laws of Shabbat, etc., all those things might be pointing to a much wider theme about how we live our lives as a Jewish people. Speaking of dreams, I want to add one other point. The first dream that Yosef interpreted with the butler and the baker, remember the butler was dreaming about grapes, and the baker was dreaming about grain and baking, which makes sense. Everyone dreams about what their field is. For some reason, Yosef understood that the baker is going to die and the butler is going to live. If you know agriculture in Egypt and Israel, Egypt is known for its grain. Remember, Egypt has lots of sun. That's why Ra, their sun god, is one of their big major gods of Egypt. They have the Nile River. The breadbasket of the Middle East was always Egypt because of the Nile River and the sun and their climate. You don't hear of any wineries, famous wineries in Egypt, do you? Grapes, maybe they grow a little bit, but they're not a major crop in Egypt. On the other hand, land of Israel is known for its grapes, for its wineries. Israeli wines are sold everywhere to this day. So if you look at future industry, Egypt is a country known for its grain. Israel is a country known for its grapes, for its wine, and for that production. So it could be Yosef sees that the symbol of Egypt, that's going to be the baker. Remember, Pharaoh himself has a minister in charge of baking because grain is so important. The symbol of Egypt will be the baker. The future symbol of Israel will be the butler, the wine and the grape. And it could be Yosef sees that ultimately Egypt is going to fall and Israel is going to survive. And that might be the deeper meaning behind this interpretation of the dream, that the butler is going to live and the baker is going to die. So again, it might be taking into consideration the nature of agriculture in Israel and Egypt. Maybe Yosef was onto something very deep that has a lot to do with the future theme of Chumash. And we'll again say, everyone have a wonderful Shabbat and a wonderful week.